quote, weights and measures may be ranked among the necessities of life to every individual of human society. The importance of measurements stems from their abundant usage, making the measuring apparatus, the system of measurement, equally important. In the late 1970s, after centuries of perpetual discord, conflict between the U.S. government and labor broke out regarding new legislation which aimed to replace the U.S. customary system with the metric system. A failure to compromise on behalf of both opposing parties has paradoxically had both little and great effect on American life overall.
You find it easier to use a meter and kilogram. Smart citizen, and use the number 10.
The U.S. customary system began as a conglomeration of many other measurement systems, allowing it to develop without set standards. Accordingly, fraudulency became a commonality in trade until English monarchs established definite measures. Other European countries, namely France, shared these issues. Consequently, the Paris Academy of Science developed a universal system, the International System of Units, in the late 17th century. It became known as the metric system. In the first annual address to Congress, George Washington addressed need for an established system of measurements in the U.S. Thomas Jefferson, tasked with this endeavor, suggested going metric. However, Congress disregarded this and future counsel as it was not a priority. On account of heavy resistance, France did not become metric until the 1830s, though delayed, their adoption inspired surrounding countries' conversions. Due to extensive overseas metrication, the U.S. authorized use of metric units in 1866, but as it was neither promotional nor mandatory, it was largely disregarded. In the late 1870s, the first organized metric advocacy and opposition were established. By the 1890s, dissension had swelled. The most notable enmity came from Frederick Halsey and Samuel Dale, who presented works detailing the failings of the metric system and feasible repercussions of conversion to Congress. In the early 20th century, several federally funded groups were created, including the National Bureau of Standards, or NBS. In 1968, the U.S. metric study began due to pharmaceutical conversion. It aimed to address the concerns of industry workers and advise the government on the best course of action. The study concluded in 1971, stating that some industries were willing to convert while many remained opposed, and metrication would allow more vigorous foreign trade, thus aiding the economy. In line with this, the study suggested converting within the subsequent years. Though other countries began converting, Americans maintained that conversion would be futile as the economy was flourishing, most international trade was bulk measured items, and most trade was with the British Commonwealth, which had not yet converted. Then, in the early 1970s, the British Commonwealth divulged plans for conversion. This did little to change the minds of Americans, though. Regardless, it did resonate with legislators. In 1974, the Metric Conversion Act was introduced in the House of Representatives. The Metric Conversion Act declared the metric system the, quote, preferred measurement system, but stressed that conversion was voluntary, as legislators believed that it would pass only if it was economical. In addition, this legislation would create the U.S. Metric Board, or USMB, responsible for aiding companies in the process of conversion, yet not an advocacy group. The House opposed the bill, as metrication would require federal compensation for workers' expenses. The most aggressive opposition, though, came from labor unions. The core issue was the belief that conversion would lead to widespread job loss. It was widely believed that workers would be unable to learn the new system quickly enough, resulting in dismissal, as the company would not be profiting. Also, workers feared that metrication would lead to jobs being placed offshore, as companies would be able to manufacture more cheaply on foreign soil if the same system was utilized. At this time, some industries began converting to the metric system, such as soft drink manufacturers and oil corporations, as growing their companies was more important than providing workers with job security. Workers did not contest their conversion strongly, as they had little power to stop private companies' conversion. However, the majority of the labor force remained objected to metrication. Despite tenacious demur, in 1975 the Metric Conversion Act was signed into law by President Gerald Ford. Upon signing the legislation, Ford said, quote, "Indeed, if the legislation is not founded on public acceptance, it will have less than no effect at all," cementing the bill's voluntary nature and creating the substratum on which resistance, labor unions fearing the bill's impact on their lives, would rise.
A lot of the backlash also was orchestrated by American labor, which saw it as part of a move to make it more easy to shift jobs offshore.
Though most labor unions shared similar notions, an organized opposition was never established, as additional industry-specific rationality prevented a collective statement. Though never unifying under a single body, each industry took a similar approach to opposition, as rather than aggressively protest, independent labor unions simply refused to use the system, and because conversion was officially voluntary, the government could not force it. As an increasing number of industries refused to use the metric system, the USMB and NBS became more aggressive in their advocacy, promulgating in a multitude of ways. Due to increasing advocacy by the U.S. government and the refusal of labor unions to use the metric system, conflict augmented. Where one entity saw exponential economic growth, the other saw a great loss of American jobs, and neither side was willing to compromise on such salient issues. As tensions mounted, average citizens began speaking out. Supporters contended that the metric system was more rational and the opposition too patriotic. However, those averse claimed that metrication was irrational, posed a threat to national security, and was unpatriotic. Regardless, most Americans, though finding lively debate in the matter, were relatively unconcerned with the issue, as it did little to influence their own life. The only instance of civilian opposition occurred in 1977, when the Federal Highway Administration announced plans to convert all highway signs. As this would impact average citizens' lives, many sent letters which detailed their oppositional position to the FHA. Though once the FHA abandoned their plans, civilian opposition drastically decreased, it did compound the government's growing struggle with labor as civilian opposition offered unions support. In 1978, the USMB faced criticism for its part in advocating for the metric system, as it was designed to be objective. In response, attempting compromise, the board added anti-metric members. As a result, the infrastructure of the board began to crumble, and eventually it claimed that it, quote, lacked the clear congressional mandate necessary to bring about national conversion and cease conversion efforts. In 1982, Ronald Reagan disestablished the USMB due to the lack of interest in metrication and in an attempt to reduce federal spending. The Department of Commerce's metric program took up its mantle, its advocacy leading to the passage of the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act of 1988, which amended the Metric Conversion Act. It stated that America was at a growing disadvantage in foreign markets and suggested conversion. Although this legislation was ignored by labor unions and the public, it was successful in complete governmental conversion. For the following years, conflict was tenuous, until September 23, 1999, when NASA's climate orbiter crashed to the surface of Mars. It was determined that the orbiter crashed because the engineers used English units, whereas the operators used metric units. This reignited mild conflict. Today, the U.S. is one of 3 developed nations to use customary units. Vestiges of the conflict and lack of compromise between the U.S. government and labor can be seen in a myriad of industries. Some have converted, such as food industries in which soft drinks are sold by liters. Some argue that this is evidence which demonstrates that America, whether officially or not, is a metric country. Conversely, other industries that oppose conversion have done very little to become metric, such as the jewelry industry, which continues to sell jewels by carats. Due to America's failure to adopt the metric system, many individuals of other nationalities regard Americans as stubborn, lackadaisical, ignorant, and too patriotic. Over time, conflict lessened substantially, becoming more akin to debate. Rationalizations have maintained many original ideas, but have also expanded to include new technology and industries. In short, following centuries of debate, the Metric Conversion Act was passed, becoming a catalyst for several years of conflict between the U.S. government and labor unions. Labor unions' opposition was characterized by whole industrial entities independently refusing to use the metric system. The government responded by fiercely advocating for metric conversion using intense propaganda campaigns. After several years of growing conflict due to added pressure from within the USMB and civilian opposition, the U.S. government and labor unions alike abandoned metrication, rather than seeking negotiation and compromise. Both parties' failure to compromise has made America one of 3 non-metric developed nations, which has had numerous effects on American industry and society. Accordingly, whether 1975 conversion was in America's best interest continues to be debated throughout the country. Overall, conflict between labor unions and the American government in the 1970s regarding metrication and the failure to compromise has played a substantial role in making American industry what it is today, even if that means allowing it to remain fairly unchanged.
Good grief, who can keep track of the inch and foot, yard and rod, league and mile, teaspoon, tablespoon, pint and quart, bushel and a peck, not to mention avoir, du pois, and